Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the University of Utah's Campaign Management class, Political Science Department, the Alumni Association, and the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute. We would like to thank our streaming sponsor, AARP Utah, for making our virtual forums this fall possible. And we would also like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the 2020 election brief, What Happened and Why? We are joined by panelists Jim Curry, Assistant Professor of the Political Science Department, Heidi Hatch, KUTV News Anchor, Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics and Vice President of Government Relations at the University of Utah, and our moderator, Dave Buehler, Regents Professor for the Political Science Department. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the YouTube chat. We will address questions once we have completed our moderated panel discussion. And with that, I will turn our time over to our moderator.
Okay, well, thank you, Anne. It's really a pleasure to moderate this Hinckley Forum as we hope to sort out, best as we can today, what just happened and what it means for our nation, state, and communities. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the insights of our distinguished panel of experts. Of course, 2020 was a presidential election year, the 58th in our nation's history, but the first conducted during a global pandemic. The level of interest among voters was remarkable as Americans turned out or turned in their votes at record numbers. Voter turnout is estimated at 67%, the highest percentage since 1900, 120 years. That is remarkable. And all of this during a pandemic. The campaign for president has been going on what seems like a very long time, nearly 2 years. The first Democratic presidential debate was in June 2019, and 23 candidates qualified to participate. With close races in several states and millions of ballots yet to be counted, we may not be able to say with certainty who won that race, but we can make some educated guesses as to what might happen. And as it has over so much of American life since March, the coronavirus dominated this election year, often eclipsing the economy as the top issue on the minds of Americans. It changed how millions of Americans voted, and yet, importantly, as I noted, it did not discourage voting. Here in Utah, for the first time in more than 11 years, the governor's seat was open, attracting a large number of candidates. On the Republican side, 8 candidates sought the office. 4 were eliminated at the state Republican convention, with another 4 advancing to a spirited June primary. On the Democratic side, a first-time candidate quickly won the support of his party and ran a very credible race, giving voice to those wanting a party change in the state capitol. In the always contested, hotly contested 4th Congressional District, the airways and social media were flooded with negative ads, attracting more than $22 million in spending, mostly by PACs and party committees outside of Utah. There were many other important races and issues up and down the ballot, and we hope to discuss many of them this afternoon, including state legislative races, county elections, and constitutional amendments. We will also take questions from the audience, including from my campaign management class and Jim's American presidency class. Please use the chat function to type in your questions, and Molly Wheeler from the Hinckley Institute of Politics is moderating the chat, and I will do my best to incorporate your questions into our discussion. So with that, let's begin. So Heidi, I'd like to start with you. As a reporter, you've covered the 2020 campaign, and today, the day after the election, if you were writing the headlines for us to read or view, what would the headline be for both the national race and for the situation here in Utah?
I think it's wait for it, razor's edge, undecided, nationally, maybe instead of a blue wave, a blue flop. But I think there's just a giant question mark in the air today. And I think people wanted to feel relief from all the tension that's been building for months and maybe even more than a year. There's not going to be any relief, I don't think today at least.
Okay, what about on the state races? What would the headline for that be?
On the state races, I think we saw what we thought we'd see. I think we thought we'd see a new Governor Spencer Cox. The one twist and turn I was not expecting last night was Chris Peterson holding out on conceding the election. That was a little bit of a surprise, especially after they taped that PSA together saying that they were being civil and working together and being kind. And then I was like, wait a minute, is this matching up? But I think on the state level races, everything happened according to what we thought would happen.
He did concede, but was it after the 10 o'clock news? I don't even remember for sure.
It was probably close to maybe 11:30 or something like that. Yeah.
I missed that news window. Well, let's start. Let's talk about the presidential race. And so, Jim, I wonder if you would just comment on where we are and when we might have that certainty that, as Heidi said, eluded us last night into early this morning.
Well, where we are is that we have a presidential race where the Democratic candidate is doing better this time around than 4 years ago, with Joe Biden picking up a couple places, notably Wisconsin and possibly, though not called by everyone yet, Arizona, that were lost by Hillary Clinton, and putting a number of states into play that by this time 4 years ago had already been called for the President Donald Trump. But that said, there's still a whole lot of votes to be counted, and there's still a whole lot of states that haven't been called. We could find out who is a likely winner as early as tonight. If Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan all declare winners or project winners this evening, which is possible, we could say that Joe Biden appears to be the winner or is the apparent winner. But even if that happens, we're likely to have potential recounts in Wisconsin, potentially other states. And it seems like we may be waiting even longer to get final results from states like Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So really the answer is maybe we'll have some inkling of certainty tonight, but we may be waiting for a very long time to have absolute certainty over who's won the presidency.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting as the results come in, because this is what the calls I'm getting are, seriously, we don't know? No, we don't. That is the thing, so it's, if you look back to the past elections, most of the time or often we have to wait past that night. That's just the reality. When you start looking at the laws around the states, and Jim was mentioning a couple of these states, like you look at Pennsylvania, for example, their laws, they don't even start counting the ballots until the day after. And you got a couple of states around that are like that. We can't kind of forget the pain and the frustration of some of these election cycles, but this is kind of how it works. If the process is working the way it's supposed to, it's a little frustrating, but the process is the most important part, particularly when you have some people, particularly President Trump, are saying, I might want to challenge some of these things. And we are seeing his administration saying they might challenge Wisconsin already, do some kind of a recount. So it might be even past today, even though I think Jim's right, we may get a pretty good flavor by this evening.
So what you're saying, Jason, is it's not unusual for the results to be counted after, say, midnight on election day. That is the normal way things work.
So it is the normal way, but particularly in this election where everyone's voting by mail. That's the thing, is some might think, well, it's by mail. That's so easy. But you say, well, first, every single ballot has to be received and processed, and they have to do this processing in a healthy way given COVID, and it just takes a little more time to do it if you want to do it right. So that is just a reality. Sometimes you have a landslide. You get 270. It's not often, right, Jim? I mean, there's occasions, but usually, go ahead, Heidi, but usually we got to wait.
Yeah, Heidi?
And I actually think this is a little bit healthy because the sausage is always getting made behind the scenes. And when we have it called early, the work is still always happening. We all know that's still going on, but a lot of people aren't paying attention to it. So I think it maybe helps the American people understand the process, how it works, that elections are not certified on election night. It's 2 weeks after the fact. We get a little bit of a taste of that with the 4th Congressional District here in Utah and a couple other tight races. But it really is good to understand that we're always counting votes after election. We're not always paying attention, but the work's always being done. So now we actually get to watch, participate in the process, and sweat a little.
And if I could, I think Americans should be pretty happy with the process as it's played out. We're conducting a major election, a national election with elections all throughout every state, and for the presidency in the middle of a pandemic with all new voting procedures for some states, and things have gone pretty smoothly. And if we're in a position where we could find out who the likely winner is the day after under those conditions, well, really election administrators throughout the country should be getting a round of applause, because this has been, like, I think for most of us, gone well beyond our wildest dreams from a counting votes and processing votes standpoint.
I was wondering if Jim was going to go back to the 1800s when you had to send the horses out
I
to
can.
let everyone know.
Yeah, can you imagine? I mean, we are used to instant gratification, and we want to know, as soon as we turn on the TV, but that's just not the way it works. So here's a question from the audience. Who's officially responsible for calling the final results? So actually calling the election. Jim, you want to?
Sure. Well, first, there's at the state level. So each state certifies the winners, and each state has different rules about exactly which official does that and by which date. Sometimes it's a couple weeks after election day. In some states, it's almost a month after election day. But first, each state certifies the winner of each race. But when you're talking about the presidency, that's only step one, because then eventually you still have to get on to the actual Electoral College electors, who we don't spend a lot of time talking about, casting their specific votes. And then the election really isn't final until Congress counts them in January. So really, when you're talking about when are election results official, it's not like, I think as Heidi and Jason both said, it's never election night. And with things like the presidency, it's literally not until January.
Yeah, now hopefully we'll know the winner long before January, right? I don't know if any of us could stand to wait quite that long. But there's already been some talk, I think the president mentioned it last night, about taking this to the Supreme Court. And that was a question that I was thinking about, and also one of our audience members has asked about that. Is this just like automatically headed to the Supreme Court, or what would it take to take this election? Whoever wants to grab that one first. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not a law professor here, but the last time that we've seen that, and I think really the only time we can look at that has any relevance to now is 2000, when you're looking at Florida and the dimple chads, the hanging chads, the pregnant, whatever, all the chads. And that was when we were looking at Bush and Al Gore. I don't know that we know that we're going to get to the point of the Supreme Court until there's a specific issue raised. It's not really written out, to my understanding, in the Constitution how this gets solved. We do know if there's an electoral tie that ends up going to Congress, and part of it to the Senate and part of it to the House. But I don't know that there's any specific rules with the Supreme Court until maybe one of the candidates calls for it to go to a court and heads that direction.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. And even when in 2000, when that went to the Supreme Court, that was after the Florida process had finished. They had certified a winner, and there were court challenges at the state level and all of these questions about how ballots were counted and so forth. But it certainly wasn't before all the votes were counted. It was quite a bit after. But Jason, or?
Well, I'll give us a comment. And for all the classes that are watching, what Heidi says, right, you should do a little search for all the different kinds of chads. And that's always a fun process here. But it's not a foregone conclusion that the court will be involved necessarily. There does need to be, in theory, some kind of actionable claim. Something has happened that requires the courts to intervene. And the fact that one lost is not enough of a claim, but they'll start looking into various states. They'll look for, some candidates will look for irregularities in some places where multiple ballots were bounced out or counted when they shouldn't be, or there's some kind of issue. And around the entire country, every once in a while, you have pockets of those kinds of issues. But I don't think it would be appropriate to say, no matter what, there's going to be a legal challenge, or at least that gets to the Supreme Court. That does happen often, but we should not start with that assumption.
Yeah. And really the key is, like, for the election to be decided by the Supreme Court in any realistic sense of that, you also have to have these challenges, and they have to be challenges that happen in a state or in enough states where if things were reversed, you would change the winner. It's possible you'll have challenges of the vote counts in a couple states, but if, say, for instance, Joe Biden wins most of the remaining states and has a pretty healthy electoral college lead when those challenges are being heard, it may not even make a difference in terms of the winner or loser anyway. So, it's kind of really too early to tell whether any sort of legal challenge could play a pivotal role in the outcome.
Heidi mentioned that one other place that the election could be decided is in the House of Representatives. So this would be if, as these votes are counted, if there is a tie, which is theoretically possible. So Jim, can you kind of brief us on how does that work if that were to happen? this comes down to 269 versus 269 electoral votes, then what?
Yeah, and it could still happen given the states left. There is a possibility, though it's not a really high, it's not a very likely one. But so what happens if you have a tie in the Electoral College, or otherwise if you don't have a clear winner in the Electoral College? And there's other ways that can happen. Congress can actually throw out a state's votes if they think there's irregularities or if there's a successful challenge in their joint session to those votes. What happens is the House of Representatives, the new House of Representatives, the ones that is put in place after this election, and the new Senate pick the president and vice president respectively. In the Senate, they just do a normal vote, and whoever gets the most votes, whoever gets a majority, becomes the vice president. In the House, they vote with one vote per state. So essentially what you get is each House delegation taking its own internal vote, and whoever wins that internal vote, that's the vote that it goes for. That's the candidate that wins that state, and you need to win 26 of the states to win the presidency. And so you even have this like possibility where the House to decide the presidency, that you wouldn't have 26 states come to a decision because you may have a couple states that are deadlocked, in which case you don't have a presidential winner. And then even that's in that likelihood, the vice president gets to become president. So there's all sorts of crazy scenarios that I think most of us always just hope never happen.
Yeah. And so in that case, they don't have to follow the popular vote at all, right?
No, they just have to pick among the top finishers in the Electoral College. So they can't pick any random person. They'd have to pick among people who received Electoral College votes. And usually it's people who received in the top 5. And so they'd be picking among Biden and Trump for the presidency and among Harris and Pence for the vice presidency. But they can do whatever they want, basically.
A little bit of history. Oh, I'm sorry, Heidi.
I was gonna say, what about Kanye? He did get like 4,500 votes in Utah last night. No Electoral College votes, but you never know. It's 2020.
Maybe he'll get one. I don't know.
That
Well,
could be
just a small
that
historical
could be
perspective.
just fitting with the weirdness of 2020 that it's decided by the House and they picked Kanye. But anyway, I don't think that's too likely. But Jason, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say one note to this great point from Jim and Heidi. Go back to 2016. That is why Evan McMullen was so important here in the state of Utah. You saw him get something like 21% of that vote because he was trying to get one electoral college vote, right? One vote, so he could be actually on the list of someone that could be selected by Congress. That was just to say when Utah was in play at one point for that one, at least. For that brief moment, people were hearing about this guy named Evan McMullen. They might not have heard much about him since, but at the moment, that was important.
Yeah. All right. Let's shift gears to the governor's race. We'll probably come back to the presidency again, just because there's so many things to talk about there. But as was mentioned, it wasn't too big a surprise that Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox was elected last evening. And I'll just note a couple of things about that he's the first lieutenant governor in Utah actually elected as governor. We've had a couple who became governor, and he's also the first governors elected from rural Utah since 1948. So there's a couple of little factoids for you. But Jason, tell us kind of about the governor's race and how you saw that come down, as well as the other statewide elected races that were settled, that appear to be settled.
I'll go through a couple of those because we referenced it a little bit too. This was not a surprising outcome. The hardest race here for Spencer Cox was in that primary that he had, where he had multiple really experienced people that he was running against. And really that was the hardest time he had going into this race. Utahns, as you mentioned, has been picking Republican governors for quite a while and not a whole lot of competition. I guess the only thing that distinguishes this particular race was the fact that Chris Peterson and Spencer Cox spent time, well, kind of campaigning together of sorts, I'll call it that. I mean, the skeptic might suggest that wouldn't have happened if it was a really close race, but maybe. But the fact that commercial where the two of them were together talking about civility, but also talking about the fact that they would accept the results of the election really was a bright spot on the national scene. And I know that's true because it got picked up nationally. You started seeing some of those commercials, in places where you say, wow, look at that. We've looked at the whole country and here's one little light. And I think that was one of the distinguishing characteristics of the governor's race.
And you're right. The June primary is much more tense than this one. But so as we think of Cox-Henderson administration with Senator Deidre Henderson as elected as the new lieutenant governor, do you see any ways it will be different than the Cox or the Herbert Cox administration as you have a lieutenant governor take over? Is it going to be the same, or are there things that are different where maybe we can anticipate? How's your crystal ball looking today, Jason?
Okay, I'll give you a couple of ways they're similar, and then I will just tell you I think that Spencer Cox is going to work very hard to distinguish himself from Governor Herbert. I believe he will try to do that to chart his own path. But there are a lot of similarities in these candidates. Spencer Cox was in the legislature for a little while before he became the lieutenant governor. He's worked his way through local government as well, through like a mayor position, for example. So he found his way into the spot in a path that was not completely different than Governor Herbert, who was a former county commissioner as well as before he became the governor. So the two of them have a little interesting similarities in terms of their path. But Deidre Henderson also, just like Spencer Cox, came from the legislature for a period of time. And I'll tell you, having been in the governor's office, it is helpful to have a lieutenant governor that has worked in the legislature. I know, Dave, you worked in the legislature too. It's just helpful to have someone that can just make that phone call, go upstairs, not be kicked off the floor when you go in necessarily. Sometimes that still happens, but I think those are a couple pieces where they're going to be very similar. But what is difficult here is that Governor Herbert is ending his administration with the worst situation ever, with this pandemic hitting the state like it is. And Spencer Cox doesn't get to take a break from that. That's going to be a difference in these administrations. He's going to have to hit the ground running immediately. In fact, right now, even before he takes office, people are expecting him to start helping to work through the solution to this pandemic.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because Governor Herbert took office in like the worst recession, or actually it came right after he took office. And then things got pretty good. And then as he leaves, he's got this big problem that Governor-elect Cox will get to inherit. Any other thoughts on the Utah governor's race? Heidi, looked like maybe you were.
I think age may play into this a little, as you mentioned. I think Governor Herbert has been giving 100% while he's there, but he's 73. I think he's ready to retire. Spencer Cox, there'll be good things and probably bad things that come with being younger. I think that he'll still have a little bit of a learning curve once you actually take over the role of governor. It's different than being vice governor, as my kids used to call it here. So I think that there's going to be a new level of responsibility he has to step up to the plate. But I also think too, when you're younger, you might think of things in a different way. I'm hopeful, like Jason mentioned, that he'll work with the legislature. I think there's been a little bit of butting heads, especially since the constitutional amendment changed on the ballot just this last time that allowed the legislature to call themselves into session, which I think plays the governor and the legislature against each other in some way. So hopefully he'll be able to work with them. But I do think he has a chance to make a name for himself, to make changes, to have a fresh approach. But I also think that he's going to have accountability on the issues of homelessness and also heading up the COVID task force, where I think there have been some questions about how money was spent, if it was done wisely too quickly, which under difficult circumstances, understandably, but he's got a lot on his plate.
Can I give one more comment to those great points, Dave? Because I served as the transition chief of staff for Governor Herbert when he came into office from the lieutenant governor role. And I'll tell you, it's not the easiest transition. And for these candidates, what Heidi said is so right, is as the lieutenant governor, it's important for sure, but you're kind of cheerleader. You're one that kind of gets to help support. And people kind of care about what you say, but almost overnight, everyone cares about what you say. And that is a big difference. So you almost have to be so thoughtful about it. When it's in the big chair, it's not really something you can just push off to someone else. Not that he would, I'm just saying it's much more import. And that's the difference, and why this transition from lieutenant governor to governor is such a big change. Doesn't seem like it is, it's just across the hall. But in terms of its import and the influence and the responsibility, it's the Grand Canyon of difference.
Yeah,
and maybe
I
on
wondered
Twitter,
if he'll be as active on Twitter
yeah,
as he's been as lieutenant governor, for example.
He's put his foot in his mouth a couple of times. I think that people have liked seeing him on Twitter because he's talking about the Utah Jazz and he has real talk. But when you go back and actually look at some of the things he said about President Trump, and he kind of had to change and smooth over, I think we may be seeing less tweeting. I don't know. Maybe he'll be very open and still tweet. But I think the fun-loving Spencer Cox that was a little wild and crazy on Twitter may have to dial it back a little bit as governor.
All right. Thanks. I want to shift back to the presidential election just for a minute. We have an audience question about what happened to this blue wave that was going to overtake the country? Doesn't seem like it materialized. Does this just mean that polling is never going to be reliable? Jim, do you want to attack that one first?
So I think there's an issue here first in that people thought that they needed to expect a blue wave, which I was kind of shocked to find out last night because it certainly wasn't what I expected, in part because the polling didn't consistently show a blue wave. There were some polls that showed the possibility of a blue wave. There were also some polls that showed the possibility of Donald Trump winning the election and things going even more going strongly in a Republican direction. The reality was that a blue wave from the polling and from the models, the election models, was something that was a possibility, but a really low likelihood possibility. Yet it seems a lot of Democrats, I think, in their enthusiasm to get to election day and to rebuke Donald Trump and to win the election in this really overpowering way, started to internalize the expectations that this would happen. This isn't to say that when all is said and done, we won't have a polling error that leans towards Donald Trump. We almost certainly will, though we don't know the degree to which we will yet until all the votes come in, since most of the outstanding votes are likely to be Democratic votes. But a blue wave was never something that was likely. It was something that was possible. What was more likely was Donald Trump loses the election, Joe Biden wins the election, somewhere between a narrow and a relatively solid outcome for Joe Biden. And those two outcomes are still very likely could still happen. We could still have Joe Biden sweep the remaining states and have a pretty solid electoral college victory, or we could have him eke it out with almost exactly 270. And so in some ways, I think people started to overstate and over-internalize the case that a blue wave was what was likely to happen rather than just one possibility that had a remote chance of happening.
So you'd think it was not as much the polling as maybe enthusiasm on the Democratic side?
I think that's the bigger thing. And they would internalize polls that showed the Democrats really high up, and they'd sort of dismiss polls that showed it a lot closer, because you had polls that showed both ways across all these states and nationally. People get excited because they want their side to win. And so you see polls that are like, wow, Joe Biden could win by 13, 14 points. Wow, that's awesome. But I think this is the downside, is when that one possibility doesn't play out, people are upset. Even though, like in a normal sense, right? If you had told most Democrats a year ago, hey, don't worry, your presidential candidate is likely to win the day after election day, I think most of them would have been happy. But a whole lot happens in the interim that changes people's expectations and changes their excitement levels.
Let's talk about where we are on the congressional level. I know a lot of these races are still to be decided. Starting with national, then we'll look at the one in Utah that's so hot in the 4th district. But so, Jim, where are we on the Senate races? It looked like a couple of them flipped on either side, but do you have kind of an update on where we are in the U.S. Senate and then what it looks like in the U.S. House? And we'll invite the others to.
Yeah. I mean, on the Senate, you still have some pivotal races yet decided. You have the 2 races in Georgia, one of which we know is going to a runoff. And you have the other race in Georgia where Senator Perdue was facing a challenge from John Ossoff that is still too close to call. You have a Senate race in North Carolina that's too close to call. You have a Senate race in Michigan that's too close to call. You had Democrats pick up some states in Colorado and Arizona. You had Republicans with probably what was actually the biggest surprise of the night, which was Susan Collins hanging on to her seat against all odds in a state that otherwise went overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. And that's potentially the race where if you're a Democrat, you're probably going to be most disappointed in that, if you're the Democrats, you probably needed Maine to take control of the Senate. There's still an outside chance that Democrats can take control of the Senate if they sweep most of the remaining Senate races, which isn't impossible, but is a lot more possible if the Democrats picked up a state like Maine, where they know they generally have more voters than the Republicans do. Let me say on the House side, you're seeing a very similar story. Democrats are assured of maintaining majority control of the House of Representatives, but they're also assured to lose a handful of seats along the way, as Republicans seem to have struck back a little bit in some of these districts that were really actually surprise victories for the Democrats in 2018, in which Republicans seem to have regrouped and won back some of these states that really, or some of these districts that really Democrats kind of shocked everyone by winning 2 years ago.
One important point to Jim, because for those of us who like to have results right away, that one Senate race in Georgia, this runoff, this might not even be decided until January. So this question you're asking about who takes control of the Senate, that could be a little while potentially.
That's right. If there's a scenario where the Democrats win the Michigan Senate race and they win the North Carolina Senate race, where it's a Georgia runoff that could ultimately decide who controls the chamber. And as Jason said, it's not until January. So if you don't want to wait a long time, that's kind of like the worst outcome you can get.
Do you think that at this point, it looks like the Republicans are holding on to the Senate, though maybe by a smaller majority? Would that be your guess now? Or
it's the most likely outcome.
Even?
Yeah, that's the most likely outcome after Susan Collins won re-election in Maine. It's not assured. Again, there's still the possibility that Democrats could sweep the remaining states, and we won't know what that's going to look like until all these late counted ballots come in. I mean, particularly in a place like North Carolina, where ballots don't have to arrive until November 12th. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in those races. And in Georgia, where we know a lot of the outstanding ballots are from the Atlanta area, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what you're going to see. But it's, if you're putting odds on things, it's more likely now, with Republicans having held on to that seat in Maine, that they will hold on to the Senate, but maybe very narrowly, 51-49.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the congressional seats in Utah, the seats here. And let's start with the fourth. We won't go in numerical order, but the one that got the most attention. And Jason, would you kind of address where we are on that and what the outcome looks like if we know, or when we might know?
Yeah, I will tell you, if there's one bright spot of this entire election, it's the fact that I haven't seen a single commercial about the 4th Congressional District. I have to tell
Today.
Today. Heidi, have you seen any more?
No, and I haven't gone out to my mailbox, but it might be the first day that I don't have a pile of junk. They wasted so much money with all those mailers that I never even looked at. They were just so nasty. So I think it's a relief to everyone, even if we have to wait a little bit for this race to have all of that gone. But if we want to look at last year, where the race was within 700 votes, I believe it was November 19th when McAdams finally declared victory. So it's going to take a while for counties to get their votes in. So we probably have to take a deep breath and wait on this one. It's going to take some time.
Yeah, if you go back to that last race, Heidi's right. So less than 700 votes. But when we all went to bed on election night, Ben McAdams was only up by 5,400 votes.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty close at the time. So when we went to bed last night, it was 7,765, something like that. So he had a little bit bigger margin right there. But what I'm waiting to see, which is so interesting, this 4th Congressional District, is how Utah County and Salt Lake County play out in the votes. You look back to Ben McAdams last time he ran against Mia Love, and he had some pretty great tailwinds that were helping him. I mean, Democrats were showing up for medical marijuana in the state of Utah, and there are a couple other ballot initiatives that really drove the attention in the state. But he didn't have any of those this time, which is interesting to see how these races are coming. In my mind, and I know everyone can talk about this, the biggest issue here was just how much outside money flowed into the state of Utah for this particular race. A lot of people know Ben McAdams. A lot of people did not know who Burgess Owens was inside the state, more nationally than here. And maybe this is something we can talk about, whether or not negative campaigning works. So it does to some extent, but I'll tell you, no one emerges from a race like that squeaky clean. It's just not a great experience for anyone.
No, it feels yucky for both of them. And one thing that'll be interesting watching too is last time around, we didn't have third-party candidates, but we had 2 other candidates in the race this time that drew 10,000 votes. So the question is, who did they draw them from? They obviously didn't like what they were seeing and wanted another alternative, knew those candidates wouldn't win. So about 10,000 of those went otherwise. Another interesting thing to watch is that at least nationally, we're seeing Republicans who were wary after listening to the president of mailing in their ballots, who wanted to vote in person or vote the day of. So the question is, will a lot of these late votes, where we had 70 or 80,000 in Salt Lake County, not sure about Utah County, will those break the way of Burgess Owens, or were they just a lot of people who were registering last second or finally deciding? So there's a big question mark in that.
Here's an audience question that fits in with this discussion, and that is, why do these outside groups put so much money into a race like this in Utah?
The balance of power. That's why it matters.
All about power.
Yeah. And that's why you don't see the money. I think a lot of people question why they don't see money in the 3 other congressional seats. They were obvious Republican wins. It would be a waste of money. But the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and the PACs around them, they have a big interest in trying to get those seats that they think are winnable and the money goes. I would like to say that stations like KUTV that have been dealing with the pandemic and not making a lot of money would like to thank them right now, because we'll have paychecks the rest of the year because of them. But yeah, they definitely are fighting for who controls Congress.
I was going to say, your employer and the other broadcast stations are the big winners out of
It's
this,
true.
right?
We
Yeah,
may
and-
cut even here after this.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, and just I think people need to recognize that for the second straight cycle, the Utah 4th Congressional District is one of the closest districts in the country. It's one of the few districts that both parties think that they can win, along with a few other districts like the Virginia 7th and a few other districts that are just razor thin. And so if you're fighting over the majority, which we know in modern American history, House majorities and Senate majorities at the national level have been really tiny. That means, you're really fighting over a relatively narrow set of districts that can swing either way. And so, a lot of people care a lot about the outcomes you can get in those places, a lot about the policy implications that happen at the national level, and they're gonna spend their money there.
So Dave, I can tell you how you win the 4th Congressional District, because it's mathematical now. So if you're a Democrat, you can win. This is still a district that leans Republican, but you got some heavily populated areas in Salt Lake County and then in Utah County as well. But here's how Ben did it last time. And if he wins, it'll be this time. You get all of your party, which both of them did. You get a small percentage of the other party, but then you rack it in with those unaffiliated, the people who don't necessarily affiliate with the Republicans or the Democrats. That is the formula for this particular district, and that's why Ben was able to win last time, and it's because he moved to the center. So this is sort of center left. That's why he has Republicans out there saying, "I'm a Republican for Ben McAdams." That's how you can win that 4th Congressional District, and we'll see if those lines get changed going forward. But right now, that's how you take care of that district.
Well, that does seem like what his strategy was, because of course a lot of his ads were Republican endorsements and so forth. And I wonder sometimes how Democrats feel, that, hey, this is our representative, but he seems to be running so much, with so much Republican support. Do you have anyone have any thoughts on that? I mean, that was I just wonder, are they kind of disappointed? Like they'd like to have somebody who is more liberal or was more just, talking about their issues, or do you think that they're pragmatic enough to just say, that's the price we have to pay?
Well, parties are, let's go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say parties are really diverse. And so you have both, right? You have people who won't even see Ben McAdams as a real Democrat or a real liberal because of how he has to run his race and win in that district. And you have other Democrats who recognize that that's what you have to do to win in that district or in a state like Utah. Parties are really diverse in that sense. And that's why they often have trouble getting along internally or deciding what they want to do internally around elections or around policy. And Ben McAdams is a good example of how those things can flare up.
Heidi?
And I was going to say he's definitely more centrist, but when you actually look at the way he votes, he's probably one of the very few in Congress who actually does vote against their party on occasion. But we should note that while that's a rarity, because most of them vote with their party and along the party line, he is voting against his party, but it's only rarely. He's still voting on most issues like a Democrat. So, yeah.
Jason, would you talk to us a little bit about the other congressional districts that we didn't see that many TV ads? We can be grateful for that. Number one, but the first district, especially, it's the first time that seat was open in like 18 years. And sort of like the governor's race, there's a little more, a little more action in the primary, but would you just talk about those quickly of what?
Yeah, so these are two newcomers to the stage. You have Blake Moore and Darren Perry was the Democrat. So what's interesting about this, what you said is right. This has been a Republican stronghold. Well, as far back as most of us can remember, you had Jim Hansen and Rob Bishop have controlled this district for 40 years, something like that. For like 40 years, they've controlled the northern part of the state, which is where this first congressional district is. And one of the interesting things for this is first Blake Moore has won this race, and he's going to be our newest and youngest member of our delegation in Washington, D.C. But what's interesting about this one is how maybe some of the issues have changed in the northern part of the state. For those two, Jim Hansen and Rob Bishop, the way they got reelected all those years is, one is, I will never let us lose Hill Air Force Base. That was it. Hill Air Force Base was ours, and as long as they protect that, they're going to be sent back. That was a big part of it. Public lands became something interesting for Rob Bishop as well, running these public land initiatives in Washington, D.C. Those were big issues for a long time. And I'll tell you, there weren't any commercials that I saw, but also those were not the big issues that people talked about up there. I didn't see much discussion about it at all. It was a civil campaign for both these candidates, two newcomers, and it's not entirely clear what the voters thought the most important issues were.
And what about with John Curtis and Chris Stewart? They both look like they're going to easily win re-election. Particularly on Stewart, he had a very spirited challenger in Del Weston. But anyway, thoughts on that?
I don't know. I think we just got what we expected there. So I don't think we really expected any different outcomes there. I know that some people had questions about Stewart because he's been such a loud supporter and proponent of the president, but that is obviously what the people who he represents wanted to see. So we will see that again. Going back to the first congressional race, though, Democrats sometimes have a difficult time finding a good candidate to run a race because sometimes they know they're not going to win. I thought that Darren Perry ran a good race. He was well spoken. And I don't know that we've seen the last of him. I think that he maybe made enough of a name for himself where maybe we'll see him pop up in politics still and find the right place for himself.
Sometimes that's a really good outcome if you're running a race that you're not likely going to win. And if you not only just survive to do another day, but you run a race that's the kind of thing where they can be called up for something else in the future, that could be something, I think Heidi's right, that could happen for Darren Perry.
Kind of like Jenny Wilson. She didn't run against Senator Romney thinking she was going to win, but giving herself the platform to possibly have the seat that she has now.
Yeah, and that's actually where I wanted to go next, Heidi. So that's perfect. Let's talk about the Salt Lake County races. And so we had Mayor Wilson, who was running for election in that seat. First time she had been on the county council previously. And like you say, she ran for the U.S. Senate a couple of years ago, was appointed a couple of years ago, now running for election. Looks like she's going to win. I don't know if that's actually been called yet, but kind of where are we there in some of the other county races that were up this time?
Well, it looks like some of those council seats are still close, and maybe we'll have to wait a little longer because there were so many last minute votes. I really think the county mayoral race really comes down to the people I was talking to, at least, that this was a COVID vote. I can't think of anything beyond the way she's handled coronavirus that would really stick in the minds of people. So they were voting on, do they support how she's wanted masks, wanted shutdowns, or do they want everything back open again? Trent Staggs, while he's been doing a good job in Riverton, a lot of people haven't had a chance to get to know him. So I think this really is the COVID vote we're seeing in Utah.
Okay. Anyone notice anything else about any other county races? I think, as you said, Heidi, some of them are still pretty close. We've got to keep an eye on them. But
yeah,
just
those the council races. Yeah.
Oh, one thing I noticed this morning, and I don't know if this means anything, they're very close, but a couple of county-wide offices flipped from R to D, I believe. If I've got that right, assessor and recorder. They're very close, but I don't know what that means. But I just sort of noted that. So I don't know if that's a trend or if that's just maybe when the rest of the votes are counted, they'll flip back.
So much of the vote in the county hasn't been counted yet that it's really hard to really pinpoint what's going on with some of these races. There's still a lot of votes out there, and I think it's going to be a while before we know, like both for the county races or also for state house seats in Salt Lake County, it's going to be a while before we really know what's going on.
And I think if you look at seats like that, you sometimes wonder why you're voting for a recorder or an assessor. And so I think if you're wanting to be able to mix it up so it's not a completely Republican run state, if you're a Republican, those might be the offices where you're willing to say, let's just give someone else a chance. You know, they're not really going to have a lot of political pull or push. They're just going to do their job. It'd be nice to just hire someone who knows what they're doing. So I think maybe that's where people feel a little leeway saying, you know, this isn't going to greatly affect my life. Let's throw a bone to the other party.
Yeah, that could be. Now, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning on the presidential race as far as this idea of counting votes after the election, but we also had an audience question on that. I guess the rules vary from state to state, right? I mean, it seems like in Utah that our canvass is about a week to 10 days after the election. Anyone know on that or what the rules are in other states? I mean, we know it's typical that votes are still counted for a while after election day, but there's different deadlines. Am I right about that? When they all have to be certified?
There are, and I think ours is close to, I was just Googling it right now, but Utah certification is not long before Thanksgiving. I was trying to look at the actual day. I want to say it's the 24th, but I may be making that up.
Okay. But it's ways out. Jason, did you have something?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Heidi's right about when that is. And you're right, these states have different rules about when the final canvass is, how quickly they have to get those results turned in.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears.
I actually
to some other
Googled it,
state.
and Ballotopedia is helping us here, but go ahead. I was going to say some of them go like, or is next week, and some aren't till December. So we have a while before certification in a bunch of states.
But I think that's a really important point for us to emphasize, particularly for our students listening in, because the various noises that we're hearing and may hear over the next few weeks could suggest otherwise. But that this is routine for votes to be counted. Now, if as long as they're votes that were received by the deadlines, and deadlines also vary, particularly on mail-in balloting, but that's just sort of normal. It's just that when we only notice it when we have a close race. That if there's a race that's overwhelmingly one way or the other, we don't realize that there's still this counting going on in the background and the numbers change slightly when it's official. But that's just kind of the normal course of things. Let's talk about the state legislative races, because of course those are going to be very important for our state going forward. And in looking at those, it seems like the biggest surprise, at least to me, was in the primary when a longtime senator in Logan, Lionel Hilliard, was defeated in the primary. And I believe the two House incumbent Republicans also lost primary races, Val Potter and Brad Dodd. It's looking like right now there may be a few others that flip. So Jason, do you want to take the first on that? What are we looking like in the state legislature?
Yeah, so I'm still watching both of these. There are a couple of key takeaways of those local races. One is I'm always amazed at how many people run unopposed in the House and the Senate. You know, you look at most of legislative leadership here in our legislature, and they don't even have an opponent. You know, which I don't know. It's just commentary that just doesn't happen very often anymore. But you know, you were right. So we saw Lyle Hilliard, he was the longest serving member of our legislature. Before he was taken out in a primary, and of course from Cache County, living there in Logan, and you know he had a really good run. He got this very popular candidate, banker, who was there that a lot of people knew in the community. Anyway, sometimes in politics, you're just there for so long, the amount of baggage that you get to carry around just becomes too heavy to lift. That's just what sometimes happens. But there's also a couple people who've been around for a long time, because the longest serving member of the House, Eric Hutchings, you know, we still have 200,000 votes come in. So what Jim said a moment ago is right. We don't know on a lot of these races. Salt Lake County still has a bunch, but you start looking like Representative Elison, Jim Dunnigan, Eric Hutchings. There's still plenty of time for them to get these last minute votes, but some of these are closer than you might think based on the historical numbers that come through for these candidates. But I'll tell you what did not change. You still have a supermajority for Republicans in the House and in the Senate. Not a lot of that changed. And I don't think we're going to see any changes in legislative leadership for this next session either.
One of the ironies, and again, you know, we're waiting for those votes in Salt Lake County to be counted, but those three House members you mentioned, I also had the chance to work with each of them. They're very well-regarded members, and sometimes they, you know, what can happen, particularly in like Salt Lake County, is that someone who may be seen in the context of the Utah legislature as being a more moderate Republican, yet then when they lose their seat, so it's a Democratic pickup, but it actually changes the Republican caucus to be even more conservative, because the moderates lose in Salt Lake County to Democrats. And so it helps the Democrats, but it doesn't necessarily. Anyway, that's just whatever that's worth.
I mean, that's a fundamental part of legislative politics that I don't think people appreciate in the American system, is that the bigger your majority, the more divided you are, which means it's going to be harder to keep people together, and the minority is going to be more coalesced behind opposition, and vice versa, which, you know, just it underscores how hard it is to actually govern in our country after these elections that we're talking about today are actually all said and done.
Yeah. I remember being
That's why in our legislature.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, Dave, that's why sometimes even the Republicans in our legislature say, wait, there are three parties on the Hill. two separate parties with the Republicans and then the Democrats. We hear that from some of them regularly. Supermajorities have some of their own issues, without question.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Heidi, you did a story just the other day on voter turnout as it relates to young people voting, and I thought it was really fascinating. I wonder if you'd take a second, particularly for our students, to just sort of recap that in case they didn't see it, and then comment if you know of whether anything changed in 2020 with this big turnout as far as young people voting in Utah.
You know, I think it's a little early for us to know what voter turnout will be like, but there's a group here in Utah called Voterize, and they're actually funded by a couple in Park City. They're nonpartisan, but they work to get people 18 to 30 signed up to vote. After the elections, they can actually pay for the documents to see if the people they signed up ultimately voted. So it may be a little while before we get the demographics on that. But Utah is a young state, and the majority of our voters are under the age of 40 right now. But we're seeing that people 40 and up are the ones who are making policy, voting, and making those decisions. And there's something to be said with when you get grown up and have your own house and you're paying taxes and your own family, that you get more involved in your community and vote. But what we're finding is if young people would go beyond the protests. This year, we've seen a lot of young people out in the streets protesting for the president, against the president, Black Lives Matter, whatever your issue is. If you would go beyond the protest and actually vote, you could really change elections. Would that change Utah to purple? I don't know that it would, but I think what it would do is make sure that the issues you care about, we are seeing that young people really vote more on issues than maybe party. You would start seeing those as more important to the candidates in the race. It's something that they would focus on if they thought they could get your vote for that. So I really think it's important to use your voice, not just in the presidential elections, but municipal elections. These are the things that affect you every single day. And I'm hoping that we see a change and that maybe this year will be the year that people realize that they want their issues that matter on the table. But it's definitely been a problem for a long time. I don't think we're going to solve it overnight, but I do think it's important to talk about, especially in a year where young people are realizing that there are issues they care about and they want to be a part of.
Okay, thanks. Let me go back to the Electoral College. We have a couple of questions from the audience on that. Let me just see if I can kind of summarize them. So there's a couple of states where they allocate their electors by congressional district. So one question was, could you see Utah ever doing that, or what would it take to do that? And I assume implied in there is that then maybe you'd have more of a chance for a Democrat getting at least one electoral vote out of Utah if it was divided by district. Maybe not though, but what about that? Jim, can you talk about that?
So I'll say this, you never know, you could have more states decide they want to take the Nebraska and Maine route and split their electoral college votes. But I always have to say this in response. I certainly hope not. If you see how much money and politics and anger gets fueled into gerrymandering when it's all just about House seats and state House seats, imagine if gerrymandering could also shift the outcome of a presidential election, how intense that would get. And that's what would happen, because if you split your vote by congressional district, now all of a sudden the state legislators and the politicians who get to draw district lines for House races and Senate races and state races, all of a sudden would get to potentially shape presidential outcomes in certain states. And that seems like a terribly bad idea.
And ranked choice voting, they've tried that in Maine this year. And that's one thing that could, I saw some commentary on this morning, it could end up costing Senator Susan Collins her seat. There was a third party that ran fairly well as they rerun those numbers for second choice. If those people that voted for the third party then vote for the Democratic candidate, it could end up costing her. I don't know if anybody else has heard about that or seen that or has a thought on that, but it will be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, Collins did well enough to get over that 50% mark.
Oh, she's
going to win.
Okay, when I saw it,
But yeah, it can.
Yeah.
And early on, it looked like there was a chance if Gideon continued to cut into Susan Collins's lead, it could have been the case that ranked choice process could have given her the boost. But as it stands now, Susan Collins will win. But that's essentially functionally the purpose of a ranked choice system, is if you can get people to buy into that system, if you get people to vote logically through that system, and it can create a system where people can vote for maybe the preferred candidate who might be a third party candidate clearly designate maybe one of the major party candidates as their second best choice, and you can get an outcome that might never actually better reflect voter choices, but it does require that people, take that process of having to vote for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different candidates and order them in terms of their preferences seriously and do it, which we haven't seen enough to know whether in enough places that's something that's feasible.
Yeah, and I think it's something we want to watch. I think it's tough to wrap your brain around because we haven't done it. It would be a big change. So I don't know that we're ready for it yet, but there has been talk of it after the Salt Lake City mayoral race. And then also when we saw all of the really strong candidates in the primary for governor, I think people said, you know what, maybe this is where it would help us narrow down who we want. But I think sometimes we have a hard enough time getting people to show up and fill in one bubble, let alone get to that point. So we might have to see other states use it and see how it works before it's something that other people would want to try.
Yeah. I want to just
I think we've not seen
more. Go ahead, Jason. Go ahead.
I just don't think we've seen the end of this one in Utah. I think they're going to keep experimenting with it a little bit. And what Heidi and Jim said is totally true. But it's just so interesting how the landscape changes if what you're running for is number 2. So, will people accept that? Well, that's my second choice, but that's great. It does take some of the, the nastiness out of some of it, but it's just so interesting. It is a change of mind about how you approach and how you accept the results of this election. But what we were just hearing is true. Our legislature is experimenting a little bit. Sometimes we get legislation on it. Certainly it's authorized now in some parts of the state.
Well, I was going to say that in the governor's race at the state convention, the Republican convention, they did use ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of interesting in watching it. I wasn't there, but just watching the numbers, that Spencer Cox all the way through was the number 1 choice. But as different people were eliminated, I think his percentage went up to like 52% of the delegates. But of course, then he had a primary with 3 other candidates, mainly because of access to the ballot by petition. And as a result, even though he won that race by about 6,000 votes, it was with under 40% of the vote. And so I wanted to just follow up on that a little bit, Jason. Do you think that there'll be a move to either with ranked choice voting or runoffs or something? There was some anxiety that, we're nominating a candidate who did not get a majority of the vote, but a plurality. Ironically, we've done it that way in city races for years, and I shouldn't say no one, but it hasn't got a lot of traction to change it. But
well, you got right to the heart of it there when you talked about those numbers, because one way to look at it is, wow, Spencer Cox got 40% of the vote. But the other way to look at it is 60% of Republicans said they wanted someone else. That's certainly not the case, it turns out, in the election now, because he seems to have won them over. But that is exactly at the heart of this thing is, do you want to have some kind of process whereby you get a majority of the people supporting this particular candidate? That's a perfect example. And I think that's what people move forward are going to use, is a race just like that. When you have a race that big with the person representing the entire state of Utah, but they got there by such a small number because it's broken up. This plurality issue is just significant in this race from candidates on all sides of the spectrum. That's why I think we're going to see it come back, is because of your exact point right there on that governor's race in the primary.
It will be interesting to see if legislators want to take that on, or now that they've got a new governor and things just if it just kind of goes back on the back burner. One of the questions from the audience is about the results in Arizona. Again, it's too close to know for certain, but it appears that state has flipped from Democrat to Republican on the presidential race, as well as it's one of the flipped Senate seats. How surprising is this to see this longtime Republican state, the home of Barry Goldwater and so forth, John McCain switching?
I think this is one of the more predictable things from last night or today, or however you want to think about it, in that, and to some degree, it's still jarring. We've seen this state go from a fairly solid Republican state in the 2000s, where, 10, 12 years later, all of a sudden, it's a state that not only is competitive, but seems eminently winnable for Democrats, where now they will likely control both of the Senate seats in Arizona and probably have won it at the presidential level. And it really reflects, to some large degree, the shifting demographics around who favors which party, where suburban voters have shifted pretty hard over the last 48 years towards the Democratic Party and towards Democratic presidential candidates and congressional candidates in particular. And Arizona is a state that's really heavily suburban. It's also really heavily, non-white and Latino, especially Southwestern Latinos, who are far more likely to vote for the Democratic Party than maybe Latinos in some other parts of the country. The demographics of Arizona have just made it sort of like the perfect kind of state to watch how demographic change and how partisan change around those demographics has really shifted which states are in play for which parties. And where potentially the future of our politics is for where Democrats and Republicans are going to be contesting elections and contesting seats in Congress.
I think the conversation.
Oh, go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, I was going to say, I think the conversation in Arizona is interesting too, to look at their little bubble, because you're looking at Senator McCain's family, who's had some dust ups with President Trump. And you're also looking at former Senator Jeff Flake, who's been, outspoken against the president. So I think that conversation that goes on there doesn't mean that necessarily they'll always be Democrats. They might be open to Republicans, but maybe not as loud or boisterous or the President Trump. So, maybe the next time you have a Republican that seems more moderate, they would go back to that, because they obviously have Republican senators they've liked. And it seems like they're listening to them now as they're saying, I'm still a Republican, but in this case, I'm going to vote the other way.
Yeah, I wondered if some of this is like John McCain's revenge, because President Trump had some very unkind things to say about him. And then his widow, Cindy McCain, endorsed Biden. Also, like you say, former Senator Flake. Jason, did you want to add something on that?
I was going to comment on the kind of the swoosh around the state of Utah. If you look, so maybe Nevada hasn't been called yet, but leaning blue. But you look at Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, the people around us, to the east, west, and south, they've all gone blue, at least in this election cycle. So it's just interesting to see. And I'm watching what Jim was just saying too about Arizona, because as these states start to increase in size, the urban vote becomes larger and more diverse and a little closer to the Democratic side is what we see in some of these big states and big cities. It's just interesting to watch, because people are already starting to talk, well, Utah's about to be surrounded by blue, at least in this election cycle. Is Utah heading there one day? Well, I guess that's the question. That's not today, but interesting to watch that.
That's right. States are the same color. Utah was the same as Idaho, the same as Arizona, even Nevada and Colorado. It's been a while on Colorado now, but you're right. It's changed. Another demographic thing, just following up on what Jim said, is women. I think I first heard the term gender gap back in the Reagan or Bush era. It goes back a ways, but the gender gap, and I guess we'll need to see some better numbers, but between Trump and Biden has been, historic, right? Like 23, 30 points or something like that on preferences of women and how they vote. So that also, whether that stays and that Republicans just have a hard time winning over women, suburban women, and so forth, or is it more a Trump issue? Any thoughts on that?
That's what we don't know yet, right? Like on one hand, because we've seen these shifts, these were shifts that were sort of already happening under the radar in a really low level way, but we saw the Trump presidency really bring them to the forefront. The gender gap, some of the racial gaps, some of the urban rural gaps really sort of solidify. And indeed, Biden did even better in terms of winning over female voters, at least according to preliminary exit polls, than even Clinton did. We're not going to, if this is the end of the Trump presidency, and we'll get to find out in 4 years if these things are durable, or if Donald Trump really was the type of candidate that had this maybe more fleeting impact on each party's coalitions, and we may see things sort of move maybe back in a little bit of a different direction in 4 years. But what we know is that sometimes presidential influence over their parties is long lasting and sometimes it's not. And, frustratingly for people, again, who want to know what's going on, they want to know it now. Some of these things we don't know for another 4 or 8 years when we see how things play out in the wake of a consequential presidency.
Only time will tell. And I was going to add too that Biden, when you talk to people about them, I don't know that anyone was completely sold on him either. And I don't think you usually see a vice president swaying voters. They're usually there. They make a way for about a day or two. But I do think that people are really looking to the idea of hopefully having a woman as a president someday. And Kamala Harris, in that she is a woman and she adds diversity to the ticket, I think she added some excitement and maybe some women to that ticket that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been there, and maybe played a heavier role than a vice president normally would, that was on the radar and then off again.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Heidi, because, you know, with all of this talk about trying to figure out who won the presidential election, we sort of haven't talked about that. But if Biden wins, it will be historic for the first time to have a woman as vice president, let alone a woman of color. And so, you know, again, we'll have to see how the votes end up after they're counted, but that is something we definitely should take note of and see how that changes. And then also, when you add to that, the oldest president ever elected at 77, almost 78 years old. And so it's going to be interesting if that's the way it turns out for those two reasons alone. Let me shift gears and talk about some other things that were on the ballot in Utah, specifically the state constitutional amendments. And there were 8 amendments referred to the voters by the legislature. As I talked to a few people, they sometimes had a hard time understanding what these amendments would do, and they read the very brief descriptions. And of course, there were, you know, other information available in the voter information guide that was online and so forth. But they all passed, it looks like, unless something changes. The closest one was Amendment G, which had to do with how education may be funded. Anyone want to take a stab at that, on what the results will be from that, or what the implications are? Jason?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a moment on this one, because I think this was, rightly so, the most complicated one, constitutional amendment, even more than water, which anyone tried to figure out what that one was. Of course, it passed, and that has to do with, you know, cities making sure water flows to the people that have the contracts, which is interesting too. But G was really the one that is going to have maybe the biggest impact on our legislature going forward. And just for the sake of it, just a moment on it, if that's okay, is by Constitution, income tax is earmarked for public education. And because of another constitutional amendment that can also be used for higher ed, which is important. Dave, you're the former commissioner of higher ed for the state. That this is an important thing for us. It made it so higher ed was able to get funded from this income tax. What's interesting is how this has evolved over time. Is income tax has been a really great, reliable source of revenue for public ed, as opposed to where the rest of government is funded, which is from sales tax. And that is a tax that has not been doing as well, because our economy is shifting more of a service-based economy, which means there's just not as much money available out there for all the rest of government. And so this Amendment G, in spite of how it read, because when you just read it by itself, it says, wow, yeah, use money for children and people with disabilities. Who would not want to do that? That's kind of how it read, I'll just say, but you really kind of have to dig into, no commentary on the right or wrong. This is going to pass. Our legislature wrote this particular constitutional amendment, and it's because they're trying to take care of the structural imbalance where every year more money is going in income tax, and it's harder and harder to fund state government. So the legislature very much wants this. They passed, I know this is a lot, so they passed a corollary, a companion piece of legislation that created a rainy day fund for public ed for those days when it might not be there, and also guaranteed what public ed always wants is money for growth inside the state. Those are the sweeteners that got the teachers on board and all the school boards, and they did come forward on Amendment G. But this one is going to have an incredibly big impact on our state, and we just don't know what that dollar amount is yet. How much money is going to be pushed out from income tax to these other, very, very worthwhile things that they may go forward for. But anyway, that's a lot of that. It looks like it's going to pass, but for the reasons I just explained, this is the most controversial and the closest of the votes.
Yeah, I think you explained it very well, Jason. And as someone who's been involved in this for a number of years, it just seems to me that what the next amendment ought to be more, basically the legislature bought themselves up to $600 of more flexibility in setting the budget, which if I were a legislator, I would totally be in favor of that. But there are concerns from some people in education and higher ed, what the impact could be on them. But on the other hand, now you've got, for years, it used to be that highways were funded by the gas tax. Public ed from this income tax, everything else from sales tax. Then, as you mentioned, income tax was brought in to include higher ed, and then lots of general fund went to roads. So it seems like the next step that would be most logical is to get rid of all of these funds, have one fund that everything goes into, and then hopefully the legislature responsible for how they fund it, because now it's kind of been a shell game. And this has just added more shells to the table, seems to me. The other constitutional amendment that I thought was interesting, I don't really have that much of an opinion on it, but was to put hunting and fishing in the state constitution. So I guess we're one of several states that have that as a constitutional right. So whatever that's worth.
Important in case there's an apocalypse and we have to feed our families and you run out of food storage, I guess. I don't know when it'll come into play, but we're thinking apocalyptically this year, so we're safe.
Maybe that's why. Yeah. And I guess I better go buy a rifle now. But, yeah, anyway.
You can stab him with a knife if you chase him fast enough.
Yeah.
Heidi is prepared, I can tell.
I'm really not. This is just stuff coming from being tired. And I'm a vegan, so I probably will leave the animals alone.
Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left. Is there anything that anybody had they wanted to really talk about that we haven't covered that you want to bring up? And if not, I've got another question or two we can end on.
There's always one thing I want to say at this point, because it's something that sort of bothers me always on every election night, is that you see people react very early and sort of set a narrative around an election.
Yeah.
Wait until all the votes are counted, and then take a look at what it means. I mean, you still won't necessarily know what it means or why it happened, but it's to me, it's really frustrating to watch us sort of like go through these motions of getting upset or determining like what has happened or why things went this way or why things went that way. Well, we still have millions of votes that haven't been counted. So it's just mainly just like my public service announcement that, like, be patient. As we've been talking about all throughout this forum, it takes a long time for all the votes to be counted. And once it's all said and done, then we can take a look and see like, well, who won where? And how did things turn out? And what does that maybe mean about how the election went and what the American people were reacting to? Let's not jump the gun on like setting the narrative around an election that's still going on.
I think that's a great point,
And that's hard.
Jim. Yeah, go ahead, Heidi.
I was just going to say that's hard with social media. We live in this world where people want constant information and constant updates. I think in some ways we've gotten better. I remember my first election, this makes me sound old, in 1996 when I was voting for president. I was standing in line when the election had already been called. We've at least moved away from the point where we're letting states actually vote before we're calling the elections. But I do think we just need to breathe, let it take time. Don't let the constant need for social media and media outlets to fill that airtime to make us feel like we have to have answers before we have them. Patience.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. That last night there was such a desire to know how this turned out that it did lead to maybe a framing of the issue that has maybe exacerbated the impatience that we all feel. Jason, do you want to add something there?
Well, since we're kind of doing our public service announcements of sorts, mine was connected to the polling question you asked a little bit too, because it's just important that you do your own research on these items. What Heidi said about social media is right. I'll tell you, social media is about confirmation bias. Once it knows what you like to eat, it gives you that to eat, which means you're never getting your vegetables. You're just getting the meat or the candy, maybe. That's what it is. That's what happens sometimes. So some of this bleeds into the polls as well. That's why our great friend Dan Jones, even when you asked him how he's doing, he would say, great, plus or minus 3.5%. You just got to remember what you're seeing, and don't just follow because they're not always right. Sometimes they are in some of these issues, but it's just really important that you take the time to hear the other side a little bit. You just got to. Otherwise, you just get the diet of what you've already been looking at.
That is so true. And the way that cable TV is now versus the really olden days, I'm older than any of you, so I'll play that card. When you had 3 networks, the liberals can watch one station and it reinforces them, conservatives another outlet, and somewhere in the middle and maybe left to center another outlet, and they get reinforced in what they're thinking. Just one thing I wanted to ask in our final minute. So a lot of states quickly moved to mail-in voting this year because of COVID. You think that this is something that will stick? That for Utah, we phased into it over a few years, and I think it's pretty well established here. But lots of states just quickly went to expanding absentee voting. to make it safer for their voters. Do you think that's going to continue, or once the virus is gone, we'll go back to more in-person voting? Any thoughts on that?
I think it sticks. I think here in Utah, there was a couple of counties like Utah County that were slow to adopt. But once you figure out and you do it, I think it gets higher voter participation. You've got it sitting on your counter. You can do it in your pajamas. So I really hope that maybe it gets more people voting in the end and states turn to that option. I know it doesn't feel as good when you're used to going and doing your civic duty on election day and getting your sticker. It feels weird at first, but ultimately I think it's the right direction for getting more people involved, giving them the opportunity to vote from home. Doesn't matter what your socioeconomics are. We're all living somewhere and have a mailbox.
That's great. Well, I think we'll end it there. And, maybe that's tied to why we had the largest voter turnout in 120 years, was because of more convenience for people to vote. And so anyway, I just want to thank each of our panelists. This has been a great discussion, and we'll just keep being patient until everything gets sorted out at the top. And thanks for those of you who've tuned in and online to watch this Hinckley Forum. And we'll just